We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. Jesus began his Sermon at the Mount by dealing with individual behaviors that can lead to being blessed or happy. Now in our lesson, Jesus focuses on how we deal with one another with the emphasis on forgiveness. Our first verse says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." Jesus had just established first, that the Old Testament is fulfilled in him and is under his authority, second, that external actions don't signify true righteousness. Now he began to apply those principles by giving a couple of examples of man's relationship with man. The first example deals with the law's prohibition against murder. Jesus quoted the sixth commandment from the law in Exodus saying, "Thou shalt not kill." The Greek term for kill is murder, the intent to take a life. So, this commandment does not prohibit all killing, it is a prohibition against murder. Jesus added that anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. What Jesus said here is implied in the capital punishment command declared by God in Genesis 9:6. So, we may ask, why did Jesus have a problem with this command? The problem was not with what was said, but with what was left out. The law and the earlier teachers had condemned the act of murder, but didn't address the emotions that led to it. But Jesus would do that in the next verse. Verse 22 says, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Here is a contrast between what the people had heard and what Jesus was about to teach. As long as thoughts, motives, and feelings are polluted, murder is always possible. In his authority, Jesus went on to say anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. The problem begins when a person is angry with his brother without a cause. Jesus is not speaking of a sudden flash of anger, but an attitude of resentment and hatred. Whoever harbors this attitude, Jesus said he shall be subject to judgment. Jesus' point here is that a person who has unwarranted anger against his brother deserves the same punishment that a murderer receives whether the court declares it or not. Likewise, Jesus said, "And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka," shall be in danger of the council or the Sanhedrin. The word Raka was probably Aramaic meaning empty head, and in Jesus' time, using it showed utter disdain for a person. Finally, Jesus said anyone who called another person a fool was deserving the fire of hell. Verse 23 says, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you." How does a person keep from developing murderous attitudes? Jesus here indicated that it is through prompt reconciliation with those with whom we disagree. The Lord uses an illustration of a Jewish worshipper who has brought his sacrifice to the altar in the inner sanctuary of the temple. Once there, he remembers that his brother has something against him. This grievance against the worshipper has caused a break in their relationship and their fellowship. The issue in this case is not the worshipper's own anger so much as the anger he may have caused in the other person. In such a situation, what the worshipper must do Jesus clearly states in the next verse. Verse 24 says, "Leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift." In the illustration, the worshipper who has brought his gift to the altar and remembers there is a rift between him and another brother, must leave his gift or sacrifice there at the altar without offering it, and leave the temple and first be reconciled to thy brother. Making peace or reconciling with the harmed brother or sister is so important that even an act of worship, offering a sacrifice, must be delayed until the reconciliation is complete. The truth is that worship of God is an empty and worthless exercise if we allow a barrier to stand between us and a brother or sister. Jesus said that only after the two parties have made peace with each other, can the worshipper give his offering. Broken relationships can hinder our relationship with God. If we have a problem of grievance with anyone, we should resolve the problem as soon as possible. We are hypocrites if we claim to love God while we hate others. Our attitudes toward others reflect our relationship with God. Jesus goes on to say in verse 25, "Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison." After the worshipper in the previous verse has left his offering at the altar and gone to meet with the one who has been wronged, Jesus said the worshipper must immediately make things right through reconciliation while they are together. This was an important step, for Jesus said that the grievance may be bad enough for the person who was offended to take the worshipper to court and to the judge. If the judge finds in favor of the offended party, he will have the officer of the court take the guilty worshipper and he will be thrown into prison. It would be better to settle a dispute quickly before it comes before a judge. In a broader sense, this verse advises us of how important it is to get things right with others before we have to stand before God, the ultimate judge. Verse 26 says, "Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny." Then Jesus promptly said that if the worshipper allows the dispute to go to court, and the judge rules against him and he is thrown into prison, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Jesus was saying that there would be no way for the worshipper to come out of prison until he paid the last penny. Just imagine what the worshipper could have avoided if he would only take the opportunity for reconciliation. The same thing holds true for every believer. Verse 27 says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" In Jesus' second example of man's relationship to man, he began the same way he did with the first example, "You have heard that it was said." Jesus then said, "You shall not commit adultery." He cited the seventh commandment that all of his listeners had heard, which prohibited the act of adultery. Adultery is committed when a married person has sexual relations with someone who is not their spouse. Fornication, which is close to adultery, technically refers to sexual relations between two people who are single and not married. Verse 28 says, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Again, Jesus didn't contradict the validity of this command, he expanded its meaning. He said the desire to have sex with someone other than your spouse is adultery of the heart, which is still sin. All lusting after the forbidden object is the beginning of sin, because it is lust conceiving. Jesus emphasizes that if the act is wrong, then so is the intention or desire to commit the act. To be faithful to your spouse with your body but not your heart or mind is to break the trust that is so vital to a strong marriage. Jesus is not condemning natural interest in the opposite sex or even healthy sexual desire in a marriage. He is condemning the deliberate and repeated filling of one's mind with fantasies that would be evil if they were acted upon. Here Jesus is teaching that there is such a thing as heart adultery, adulterous thoughts and dispositions, which may never end up in the act of adultery, but are just as sinful. And if looking at a man or woman with the desire to have them physically is lust, then they, who dress and expose themselves, with the purpose of being looked at and lusted after, are no less guilty. Verse 29 says, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." Here Jesus uses a person's eye to illustrate how important it is to avoid lusting after someone. He said, "If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee." Of course, Jesus was speaking figuratively. He didn't mean to literally pluck out your eye if it causes you to lust, because even a blind man can lust. His point is that we should get rid of, or avoid anything that causes us to lust, because lust leads to sin. Then Jesus gives the reason why we should get rid of anything that causes us to sin. He said it is better to lose one of our body parts than for our whole body to be cast into hell. It would be better to go into heaven with one eye than to go to hell with two because of the lust of the eyes. Verse 30 says, "And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." In this verse, Jesus uses a person's right hand to illustrate the same truth he gave in the previous verse. He didn't mean to literally cut off your right hand if it causes you to sin. His point, as it was in the previous verse, is that we should get rid of, or avoid anything that causes us to sin. Again, Jesus gives the reason why we should get rid of that thing that causes us to sin. In other words, it is better to lose one of our body parts than for our whole body to be cast into hell. When we are tempted to think it's too hard to deny ourselves of fleshly pleasures, we ought to consider how much harder it will be to spend eternity in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. Verse 31 says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce." Jesus' words were not a part of the Ten Commandments but were part of the Mosaic Law, which carried just as much weight as the Ten Commandments. Jesus was about to address divorce and how it relates to adultery by quoting from Deuteronomy 24:1. This statement by Moses didn't justify divorce, but it did regulate its abuses by husbands who divorced their wives. In Israel, wives could not divorce their husbands, so giving her a writing of divorcement allowed her to remarry as a means of supporting herself. This was more permission than a precept. When the Pharisees asked Jesus why did Moses command to give a writing of divorcement to put a wife away, Matthew 19:7, Jesus replied that Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, allowed you to put away, divorce, your wives, but from the beginning it was not so, Matthew 19:8. In our final verse Jesus says, "But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Jesus said to the multitude, "But I tell you." He wasn't indicating that what Moses said was wrong, but the way the Jewish religious leaders interpreted Deuteronomy 24:1 was wrong. Moses' words in Deuteronomy 24:1 say, "When a man hath taken a wife, and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her." The Pharisees took the phrase "some uncleanness in her" to include anything a woman's husband considered to be unclean. Jesus clarified this by saying first that there was only one justifiable reason for a husband to divorce his wife, and that was if she committed the sin of fornication. The point here is that if a man divorces or puts away his wife for any other reason than fornication, the divorce is not valid. Therefore, if she remarries, that causeth her to commit adultery. Jesus reminded them that in the very first marriage, God declared that the two of them shall be one flesh, and what God had joined together no man had the right to separate, Matthew 19:4-6. Therefore Jesus concluded that divorce is not to be allowed, except in the case of adultery, which breaks the marriage covenant. Later, in his letter to the Corinthian church, the Apostle Paul confirmed the permanence of marriage while acknowledging another reason that allowed a Christian to divorce. It had to do with unbelief in Jesus Christ, 1 Corinthians 7:10-15. Second, Jesus said, "And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery." A divorce that takes place for any other reason than fornication not only causes the wife to commit adultery if she remarried, but it also makes the one she marries also guilty of adultery. Based on Jesus' teaching here, we must take marriage as serious as he does. Those who tempt others to sin, or lead them in sin, or expose them to sin, are also guilty of sin, and will be held accountable for it. This is one way of being a partaker with adulterers. Key verses. If you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Matthew 5:23-24. If we are going to love one another, we must have a right relationship with both God and man. Our differences are to be settled quickly and peaceably between the parties involved. By doing so, we won't run the risk of God's intervention and the possibility of something worse happening to us. Thought to remember. Righteous living demands more than keeping laws. Righteousness under the new covenant is all about the righteousness of our Lord Jesus Christ. The word righteousness still means holy, unspotted, and faithful character before God, but the requirement is fully met in Jesus Christ. We cannot attain the standard of righteousness which God requires under our own effort, but it is the righteousness of Christ which saves us. We now look beyond the 10 Commandments, to the law of Christ as outlined in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. We now accept that we can never be good enough, of ourselves, to be saved, but that we are saved by the righteousness of our Lord Jesus Christ. The poor in spirit will surely be filled. Our lesson next week is entitled, Transforming Love. Our biblical reference is Matthew 5:38-48. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this week's lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. We wish you can join us at the Cubao Church of Christ soon. Our congregation is a place to discover faith, find new friends, grow closer relationship with Christ and serve with each other's gifts. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.